Jefferson, like Hamilton, believed that only Washington could hold the Republic together during this period of debate. And certainly there was no Republican candidate in 1792. The Republican Party, as it would become, hadn't really fully formed at this point. So there was no opposition candidate available. The alternative to George Washington was probably John Adams, who Jefferson deeply distrusted. It was much better to have Washington as a consensus figure that both the Hamiltonians and Jefferson and Madison and the critics of Hamilton could all agree was a worthy leader.
I think there's a tendency to read what's going on in 1792 in the light of what happens years later. In 1792, Jefferson is very anxious for Washington to take a second term at a point when nobody really thinks of Washington as the head of a party, or even of Jefferson as the head of a party. That stuff is really still getting going at that point. I think that what we need to remember is that the whole national experiment as of 1792 is still very, very fragile, and everybody recognizes that it's very, very fragile, and that Washington is really central to the hopes of making that experiment endure. Washington is being asked to run for a second term at a time when we still have British troops in forts inside our borders, at a point when the British are our main trading partner, but they have all kinds of restrictions that make it very hard to conduct that trade, when Spain is sitting on top of New Orleans and able to cut off all Western trade anytime it wants to, and at a time when the nation is potentially going to split along all kinds of sectional and ideological fault lines. And Washington is the only one, and everybody knows he's the only one, who really kind of stands above all of that and that everybody can appeal to.
I think Washington was indeed the only possible choice in 1792. Washington wasn't anxious to accept a second term. He considered resigning very shortly after he became president. He became very ill in 1790 and thought, well, the federal government is safely launched. I can resign and turn the presidency over to the vice president who can carry on from here. He quickly changed his mind because he became sort of distrustful of John Adams' ability to lead.
Washington wanted to retire after one term, but everyone around him pressed him to stay on for a second term. And so it's not a two-term tradition he's aiming at. I think what Washington was really concerned about is he wanted to leave office before he died. Imagine the precedent if Washington dies in office. Well, then it becomes a presidency for life, and the four-year elections are mere formalities. Washington didn't want that, so he wanted to make sure he got out of office before he died. I really think that Washington's greatest fear was dying in office, because his reputation was built on walking away from power. If he died in office, then he dies holding power, and his reputation is shot. So I think that was Washington's greatest fear, dying in office.
One of the things with history, you can't run the film through both ways to see what would happen. It would be nice if you could. You know, what would happen if we didn't go into Iraq, and what happens. You know what happens if we do. We don't know what would have happened if we didn't. We don't know what would have happened if Washington had not stood for a second term. But the fact that the Union was able to survive, and narrowly as it was, I think you have to say it was crucial. But of course, you can't say with absolute certainty because you don't know what would have happened the other way.